Alright, what's going on everyone, and welcome to the series in which I introduce you to all of the most powerful competitive decks in the modern format. The goal here isn't to give exact deck lists as those change constantly, but rather to give a brief overview of how the deck works so you can be prepared if you're new to the format. Today we're looking at Rakdos Scam, a black-red deck that cheats at the game and probably tries to steal your wallet. That's because the deck uses a clever interaction with cards like Grief and Fury. So ignore the mana cost on these, completely irrelevant. What is important here is that they have Evoke. What that means is you can pay the Evoke cost, which is discarding a card of the appropriate color, and you get to play them for free. Sort of. You get to play them, but then you immediately have to sacrifice them. However, they do enter the battlefield, so their enter the battlefield effects will trigger. So Grief is basically Thoughtseize. You get to look at the opponent's hand, pick a non-land, and they discard it. Fury will deal 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures or planeswalkers. So this seems kind of okay, but also kind of medium. Like Grief, you discard a card, then you play Grief, you get one of their cards. But that means you traded 2 for 1, right? You 2 for 1 yourself. So what's the trick? What's the deal here? And the answer is we're playing Undying Malice and Feigned Death. Both of these do the same thing. You target a creature, and then until end of turn, if the creature dies, you return it to the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter. So remember that Evoke puts it into play, then forces you to sacrifice it. So if you target it with an Undying Malice, for example, it will die, then return to the battlefield. So for example, on turn 1, you can discard a black card to evoke Grief, look at the opponent's hand and take a card. Then before Grief dies, you play Undying Evil. It will die, then return to the battlefield, and then that trigger happens again, so you get to look at their hand a second time and make them discard another card. Then you get to keep the Grief, and now it has a +1/+1 counter. So if you look at this from a card advantage perspective, you discarded a card and you cast Undying Malice, right? So that's 2 cards in your graveyard. You force your opponent to discard 2 cards, so you're 2 for 2, and then you have a 4/3 with Menace on the battlefield that you paid 1 mana for. So basically, you're even on card advantage, and you got a 1 mana 4/3 with Menace, which is a pretty good deal. And Fury can clear blockers, because remember, it's going to trigger twice, so it's going to deal 8 damage total if you Undying Malice it, and then it's a 4/4 with double strike. So now you can see, right, it's an absolute scam. The combination of these Incarnations and these Undying cards, it's kind of unfair. So backing up these creatures are Ragavan, Dauthi Voidwalker, and Seasoned Pyromancer. Ragavan is played in basically every red deck, so you probably know what it does, but it fits the scam theme. It's a 1 mana 2/1. When you hit the opponent, you exile the top card of their library, then you get a treasure and you can cast that card and you can use the treasure. Dauthi Voidwalker is an amazing main board hate card for graveyards. It exiles cards as they enter the graveyard, which is pretty great. It's also a 2 mana 3/2 with Shadow, which basically makes it unblockable, and whenever it exiles a card from the graveyard, that card gets exiled with a void counter, and then you can sacrifice the Voidwalker to cast spells with void counters on them, and you don't even have to spend mana to cast it. So if your opponent mills over a massive scary thing, you can just cast it. Feels kind of like a scam. And Seasoned Pyromancer is something you see frequently in these grindy Rakdos mid-range decks. It's a 3 mana 2/2, which is kind of whatever, but when it enters, you can discard 2 and draw 2, and each non-land card that you discard makes a 1/1 spirit, so you can potentially put 4 power in for 3 mana, plus you get the filter. And this is particularly useful in this deck because while the interaction between evoke creatures and the undying spells is powerful, it can also be a little clunky and inconsistent, right? You could draw your evoke stuff but no way to reanimate them. You could draw the undying spells but have no incarnations, and Seasoned Pyromancer can help smooth out hands that become a little awkward. And also, this is a Blood Moon deck. Are you tired of me talking about how scammy this deck is? Because yep, we got Blood Moon as well. It turns all non-basic lands into mountains. This can literally single-handedly shut decks down completely. 3 to 4 color decks or 5 color decks, Blood Moon is just like an instant win. It's a free win sometimes. And by the way, Blood Moon, great, not great in multiples though. So that's another use for Seasoned Pyromancer and Fury. Excess copies could just be discarded, so that's fine. And this filtering continues with Fable of the Mirror Breaker. It's a saga that that first makes a 2/2 goblin, and that goblin in turn can make treasures. And during the second stage, you can discard up to 2 cards and draw to filter and smooth out your hand. Very important for this deck to smooth out the sort of clunkiness with all the interactions, and ultimately it flips into a reflection of Kiki Jiki, which can be very powerful when combined with the Incarnations, allowing you to create token copies of them to re-trigger their effects. The deck also plays Rakdos control spells like Lightning Bolt, Thoughtseize, Terminate. Lightning Bolt, of course, classic, 3 damage, 1 mana. Thoughtseize is another way to rip your opponent's hand apart, letting you look at it, force them to discard a non-land. Does cost a couple life, but very powerful. And Terminate is just a straight up removal spell with the added benefit of turning off regeneration, so none of that regeneration nonsense. Some cards that are less common but still occasionally played include Malakir Rebirth for starters. This is just another way to scam an Incarnation into play, but it has the added benefit of being a land as well. So it's a land on one side, it's a undying spell on the other. Kroxa is also very popular in these decks. It used to be a staple in every deck. It's a little bit less common right now, but it's very similar to the Evoke creatures. You pay 2 mana for it, it enters, forces the opponent to discard a card, and then it sacrifices itself, and then once it's in the graveyard, you can escape it for 4 mana, exile some creatures, and it'll trigger and force the opponent to discard again, and at that point, it's a 4 mana 6/6, and if it gets to attack, it also triggers every time it attacks, and also if the opponent discards the lands or can't discard, it deals 3 damage. If they're empty-handed, it's dealing 9, so that's great. And note that you can't scam this into play. It's one of the problems because it only sticks if it is specifically escaped. So the Undying stuff will allow it to re-enter and make the opponent discard again, but it will still sacrifice itself because it wasn't escaped. Fatal Push and Call Against Command are additional control spells that the deck will sometimes play. Fatal Push, it only kills small creatures, but if you can trigger Revolt, it kills a lot of stuff in Modern. The command has a lot of modes, so it's very versatile. You can return a creature from your graveyard to your hand, you can make the opponent discard, you can destroy an artifact, or you can deal 2 damage to something, and you get to choose 2 when you cast it, which is pretty good. But yeah, that's the basic idea of Rakdos Scam. You basically have lots of ways to cheese big creatures into play. It is very good at ripping the opponent's hand to shreds, and you constantly blow up their permanents, you turn off their graveyards, you turn off their lands. Altogether, this deck just feels unfair, hence the name Rakdos Scam. If you want exact deck list or just the most up-to-date deck list, be sure to check the description as I will leave links to metagame tracking websites below. And if you like this video, I have an entire series dedicated to these modern deck guides, and you can find a link to that down there as well. But in the meantime, I hope this video was interesting. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.